Hello. Daranaskara, Ambawastich, and Oki, which are the traditional languages used in Treaty 7 to say hello or to give greeting. My name is Teddy Manywounds, and it is an honor to be here, not only amongst elders, amongst youth, amongst our people. I am so elated and grateful and humbled to be able to share some of the background and the justice practices that we are conducting and our conversations that are occurring on the G4 nations that which I represent. I will apologize for the agenda. There is a little bit of a misnomer in the title, whereas I will be presenting today on the conversations that I have been conducting in my nations, which are the Treaty 7 nations, Blackfoot Territory, Stoney Dakota, and Tsuut'ina Nations, regarding the models and the systems of justice, pre-contact, post-contact, and into the next generations, and what does that mean? I also want to give thanks to our presenters thus far. There is a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of information that is inherently ours that I do believe needs to not only be passed down to the next generations, but utilized amongst the generations of now so that we can create futures and we can create mechanisms of futures that are much more supportive to what it is that we require in our lands for our people, our way. Everywhere I go, and I've been so grateful to live in many different places here on Turtle Island, I always tell not only the citizens of our lands, but every citizen of Turtle Island, you are all implicated in these treaties that your leaders signed into with our leaders. You are all impacted and you all have implication, whether you have understanding of it or not, and it is incumbent that we as Treaty First Nations people continue to administer that understanding not only to the white governments that continue to try and keep us in control and under mechanisms and systems that don't work for our people, but to understand that the people of those white governments who follow those rules also must understand the original intent and the practices of the original people of these lands, which are our people. And I'm so grateful today to share some of the feedback and some of the conversations that I have, that I've had conducted in my lands and also that are ongoing. And so today, I wanted to talk about some of the justice systems and the justice models pre-contact and why those are important for us to continue not only having conversation around, but utilizing the development of our own adjudication models, our own court systems, while also utilizing something that is so important to every single one of us in this room and by the gifts of our ancestors and our elders, and that is natural law. Natural law, away from the written law and the written text of white people, can have resonance to support us towards healing and towards the intention of justice that is supposed to be administered and was administered pre-contact to these white governments. And so, the first part I wanted to speak about were worldview and perspectives. Pre-contact, from what I'm learning in my nations, is our worldview and perspective not only accounted for healing, but it accounted for the intentions regarding healing. There's it's justice. Maybe people are riled up back there, and that's totally okay. But what I wanted to talk about was that intention and the humanization of healing, and of healing in our communities, utilizing justice models that are more indicative to our practices. Justice, the way that it is currently prescribed onto us, I don't believe not only has resonance to the impact that is meant to be providing, but towards providing actual and equitable and tangible justice within our communities. I do think it is important that we look at justice models that are more indicative and inclined to be practiced by our people. When I state that, and when I have conversations with people in my lands, I also look at hunting, the gathering of medicines, the allowing of our women and girls to have safe spaces in order to practice conversation, to indicate the problems that they are feeling so that they can come back to people in leadership and in influence so that we may find more equitable and better practices that can support our women. I also think about, under justice, I do think of the economy value. The Justice spoke about this before this presentation, and the economic value in administering those principles and those practices for our people on our lands that support practices more indicative of ways of us finding value and implementing principle that is really important to our people. The current system, post-contact, is a system that heavily utilizes dehumanization and humiliation as practices to administer justice. The previous justice before me had indicated, and has been indicated in my lands, that the current court systems are court systems which are not only re-traumatizing, but unsupportive towards actually finding justice for our people and administering and acknowledging when hurt, harm, and hate has been administered onto us, even by white people who enter into our own lands. It is an extremely shameful practice of Canada, and I'm very grateful to be able to sit with the Ministries of Justice and Public Safety, and my sentiment beyond my people is always this: you should be ashamed of the systems that you have pre-prescribed and subsequently administered onto our people, because those are systems that are not only unsupportive, they further perpetuate trauma that has been instilled and administered on behalf of white Canadian governments, and those governments, when not allowing us to practice our treaty rights, our inherent rights, further exacerbate the justice, the malices of justice and the injustices that we feel on our First Nations. Now, we also need to speak about, and that something that is being spoken about on Tsuut'ina Nation and the G4 nations, is treaty-based fundings and those outcomes. Something that we are always speaking about is the fiduciary obligation under treaty, which is not a new conversation, and we are reprioritizing and strategizing how those conversations are being administered to white governments and white people, to also then weaponize the language that is used against us traditionally under legislation. And how do we responsibly utilize that language of white governments in order to maintain and recognize the requirement of treaty, not only in funding, but our treaty inherent rights, and what do those require and mean? Not the rights as administered or under repositories that may not represent our treaties and don't. I'm speaking very loosely towards mechanisms such as the AFN, which I do have respect for, but to also state to white governments that we require nation-to-nation responsible relationships that are acted and grounded in tenets of respect, and the original tenet of why we had a written treaty in the first place, which recently was acknowledged to me by a Blackfoot elder, loosely translated in the Blackfoot language, that treaty was always meant to, or alluded to, making relatives. And that is something that I think is not only extremely important, that is something that is incumbent in order for us to not only instill in white governments, but make calls to action for, so that we can not only achieve justice, but so that justice is achieved and felt in our communities. And what is that? What we discussed in my lands in Tsuut'ina Nation is justice and the worldview of justice, and how our worldview may not be in line or aligned with those of white governments. For instance, something that we talk about heavily on our nation is the practice of picking medicine. Is that not justice to those who need to be healed? The practice of making your regalia and learning to practice how to utilize that, is that not justice? The fact in finding value and giving everybody in our communities the principle and the instillment of responsibility, therefore instilling a sense of value, I think that is also important and indicates to me justice being served to those who feel as though the contemporary world is not only too heavy, it's burdensome, and oftentimes those languages that are utilized outside of our lands are not ones to provide benefit to our people. I am not necessarily somebody who is able to or going to lead a hunt, a buffalo hunt, and then subsequently practice all of the traditional mechanisms regarding the protocols in order for us to take care of that very sacred practice. However, it should be something that not only is supported, but supported because I do believe that hunting and the practices of our principles and values instill justice, and also are ways in which we can practice those and make calls to governments that those contemporary systems that were predetermined and administered onto us are not the practices that are going to allow us in the future and continue into the future generations the ability to provide objective and adjective healing, while also recognizing that our economies and our systems and ways of knowing are vastly different, including the languages spoken and the intention of that language spoken. Something that I also wanted to touch on very quickly, because it is really, really important, is the natural law component. Currently, the written law and the written context within the law is meant for white governments to hold control and to continue to contextualize mechanisms of control, not only regarding our economies, our justice, our healthcare systems, but systems that are pre-prescribed to us, and then administered through anemic funding, not funding that is needs cost-based, but funding that is pre-prescribed by Treasury departments that lack data composites to actually tell a full story of what it is that is happening to our people on our nations. The data currently not exist, at least to my findings. I'm currently conducting 2 research projects. One looks at the the well-being scores of our people on our nation as driven by mechanisms of public safety, and the other looks at proximity to larger urban centers and how that places our women and girls at harm's way or under malicious criminal practices of individuals living in those cities. And when I look for data to tell that composite and that story, it doesn't exist. And one of the reasons it does not exist is because Statistics Canada does not collect composite data for any population under 5,000. And because oftentimes they do not have jurisdiction to do so, the data isn't there. So when Treasury makes up these predetermined calculations for our funding models, those funding models are anemic at best, would leave us and our leadership to put band-aids on hemorrhages that keep bleeding out into our First Nations. And so I also want to make into account that natural law is something that is not only required, it is incumbent. It is incumbent because it allows for us to understand the world in a perspective and in a way that was intrinsically ours as gifted by our ancestors. I am looking even today at the natural law around me, at the wind, at the movement of the clouds, and everybody else may have also noticed a large amount of bees and wasps that are currently present in this space. And at least in the Stoney lands, it's always told to me that bees and wasps are the arbiters and the bringers of change. And so when I look around this room and I hear all the good work that is being done, and I look at the natural surroundings and the gifts of the living beings on our lands, I also must recognize that Creator is hopefully bestowing onto us and giving us that perspective and those tools to bring about change and to bring about justice for our people who traditionally do not feel it and cannot feel it. And the last part that I wanted to share on here, that in the conversations that we're having in our lands, is the terminology. Something that I do believe is a benefit for us to not only utilize, but to give focus to and to give importance to are the languages of intention that were spoken before the white people's language, before English became the pervasive way in which we communicated. I know that on all of our First Nations, language is not only exceptionally important, but in order for us to achieve and to feel as though justice has been served, I do think it is very important that terminology that supports those practices and supports those determinations are made. And so I wanted to say thank you all. This was meant to be a presentation regarding the conversations that I am hosting and have hosted throughout the years of my work in justice, while also recognizing that we as First Nations had a way prior to contact, and we as First Nations, when given the ability to utilize our teachings, our languages, our recognition and rights under natural law, and our rights under treaty, we can and we will, for the next generation and the next, find a way not only to achieve justice on our lands for our people, but to also show that we as the first people of these lands brought and maintained value far beyond any mechanism of control that was pre-prescribed to us by white governments and subsequent governments who may continue to try and preordain and pre-administer control onto us. Thank you all, continue the fight, and see you guys.